Thanks for staying with us on the conversation. The first half we dealt with Sierra Leone's election, and now switching gears to Paris, where South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has joined other global leaders in advocating for an inclusive and equitable green transition. During his address at the Financial Pact Summit in Paris on Thursday, Ramaphosa emphasized the need to consider the experiences and challenges faced by underprivileged nations as the world moves towards adopting clean energy. Ramaphosa acknowledged that the concept of transition varies across countries, stressing that no one should be left behind during this transformative journey, including individuals employed in fossil fuel industries.
In addition, an open letter published recently featured several world leaders, including French President Emmanuel Macron, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, and US President Joe Biden, who appeared to be aligned in their call for collective and inclusive action. As the global demand for an urgent transition to renewable energy intensifies, developing nations, predominantly in Africa, have been advocating for just transition that aim to balance their developmental aspirations while utilizing fossil fuels. Now, joining us for this all-important discussion, we have Daniel Adidi, Policy Officer at the Center for Africa-Europe Relations. He joins us live from Maastricht in the Netherlands. One welcome to you, Denny, and happy to have you join us on this conversation.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Now, Daniel, just how bad is the climate change situation in Africa, and what are the specific climate change challenges that Africa is currently facing, and how do these challenges affect the socio-economic development of the continent?
Thanks so much for the question. It is really bad, the issue of climate change in Africa, and the impact is basically felt in every country in Africa, as it were. And basically, when we talk about climate change, we talk about the rise in sea level, global warming, and basically you could see the effect of these on the environment and basically also on the livelihoods of people. We've had issues of drought that is rearing its ugly head. And for instance, you see that in the Sahel in Africa, in the past 30 years, 25% that we've experienced 25% decrease in rainfall in the Sahel in Africa. Also, we've had issues of flood. If you know, in Lagos, Nigeria, last year and even the year before, there were issues of flood. Also in Madagascar, in Mozambique, and this basically has led to the destruction of lives and property. You see also the effect of climate change also on the food systems, on agriculture, in that we now have reduced agricultural production in a lot of African countries because of drought, because of the effect of flood. While I was doing my research in Nigeria some years back, the people growing rice farmers, they complained to me that, rice has, the flood has actually swept away all their farms, and this has led to loss of livelihoods. And basically, it affects the economy of the country in that there is reduced productivity, and the funds that are meant to be used for some other things, you need now to divert those funds to cater for climate change. So we have seen the effect of climate change in increased floods, increased drought, and this is basically reducing productivity of people. And given that majority of people, of the populace in Africa, they are smallholder farmers, this has actually affected them, and especially their production. And basically the effect of this is that we need them to be importing a lot of agricultural commodities into the country, which just takes away money also and makes things expensive for people.
Daniel, from all what you've said, it's really affecting the socio-economic climate of the continent in general. And besides this 2023 Paris summit, we had a very all-important 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, and it marked a pivotal milestone as 194 nations united in their commitment to capping global temperature rise within 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Now, since then, the agreement recognized the urgent need to reduce carbon emissions and pursue sustainable energy solutions. What has been the level of progress and commitment to this agreement?
Well, I think it has differed from countries to country, from continent to continent. But essentially, what we know is that we are way back in terms of achieving our commitment in terms of meeting that target of 1.50 degrees. And so based on the level of emission that we have now, we said if we want to, only 1% will be achieved in terms of achieving that. Meanwhile, we need a progress that we make we need a 45% reduction. So based on what are the figures that we have presently, we are only able to achieve 1% of the reduction that is required rather than the 45%. So you see that we have a long way to go, especially reaching these goals that we have set for ourselves in 2030 and even at the end of the century. So we are way, way back in terms of reducing carbon emissions generally in Africa and globally too. Yeah.
So not a pretty situation, Daniel. We're way
Absolutely.
back in reducing global emission levels and also climate financing for the most vulnerable countries. Now, at the recent Paris summit, President Emmanuel Macron called for global taxes on shipping, aviation, and potentially on wealth in order to fund climate action. We've seen promises made at different COPs, with regards to financing the most vulnerable countries that are affected by climate change. All these taxes that President Macron is suggesting, will the money be diverted to climate finances towards the most vulnerable countries? And how would this help address climate emergencies?
I mean, I think the question that you have asked is a $1 million question. But I think the critical question to be asked is who is going to administer this tax? Who is going to be placed in charge of administering this tax? And more importantly, who is going to administer the fund emanating from the tax? These are critical questions that needs to be answered. You could see, I was watching a video by the president of Kenya in which he was saying, and I think that reflects a lot on what the African presidents were saying, that we need another a new order for development finance, a new order for climate finance, in which African countries also have a say in these matters. And as far as I am concerned, as far as a lot of Africans are concerned, I think it's a major issue in that we Africans, we need to have more say in how these finances are channeled. What are the agreements, what are being agreed upon, and how do we follow it up? So when you say you are bringing in taxes from aviation, from the shipping sector, it is good. Who is going to administer these taxes? Where is the pots of funds coming from there? Where will it go to? And who will administer these funds? These are big questions that need to be answered. And when we talk about inclusivity, then in terms of the structure around this, Africans needs to be included. That is one issue, or maybe I should say development countries. That is one issue that needs to be tackled. Another issue that needs to be tackled is you need to seek an agreement with all these sectors, the aviation sector, the shipping sector. We will basically, in a way, sometimes they may want to not agree with you in terms of doing this. So you need a lot of consultations, a lot of engagement to make them see reasons why. But the most important thing is what I have said earlier: who will administer this tax, and who will administer the funds emanating from the tax? I think inclusion needs to be emphasized even in this aspect also.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel. $1 million question with another $1 billion question. Just like you rightly said, the world powers, even though they agreed to this, but did not necessarily put measures on how exactly these taxes will be implemented. Now, still talking about these funds, the World Bank said developing nations hit by climate disasters would be able to suspend debt repayments, emphasis on suspension of debt repayments. Do you consider this a welcome development, or are you more for debt cancellation? I mean, because if you look at a lot of African countries, the debt profile is high. So how exactly will this suspension of debt repayments help African countries or developing countries who are facing the wrath of this climate change?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to help a lot, but I think there are some clarifications that needs to be made here when we talk about this debt repayment. Firstly, is that the World Bank is going to suspend the debt repayment on new loans, not existing loans, on new loans. And also, I think the United Kingdom has promised that they are going to suspend debt repayment for 12 African and Caribbean countries. So it's not something, it's not a largest, or it's not an opportunity for everyone, or so that is one issue around that. So it is not that, okay, all existing loads are going to benefit from it. And for all that we know, suspension is an entirely different thing, which is different from cancellation, as it were. So when you suspend it, you may suspend it for 5 years, for 8 years. Eventually, you come back to it and say, oh, you have to continue to now begin to service your debt. So I think that's why a lot of African countries are more for debt cancellation. But if you want to even then extend this argument, there is an argument now, and which I also buy into, that we don't necessarily want debt to be cancelled like that. There's what we call debt for climate swaps, in that where you promise to make some, where a country promises to make some mitigation, to put some mitigation measures in place or adaptation measures for cancellation of some certain parts of their debt. So they call it debt for climate swap. So this is a mechanism that I think needs to be promoted, which we feel can work better. Debt repayment, suspension of debt repayment, well, you can suspend it for a while, but it takes effect again after some years. So I wouldn't subscribe to that a lot. I would prefer debt cancellation, or like, okay, fine, debt for climate swaps in order to address the climate change issues that we have in developing countries, and especially in Africa.
Now, Daniel, the G7 recently said that Russia's war on Ukraine justified more overseas fossil fuel financing on a temporary basis. We've also seen countries in the forefront of the battle against climate change. A country like Germany rolling back its old coal-powered mines. But when you look at countries that are dependent on fossil fuel industry, a country like South Africa shutting down its old coal-fired plants, how do you balance the need to adapt to climate change and also the need to grow your economy? How do you strike a balance when climate financing is not forthcoming?
Absolutely. I think it's a balancing act for every country. If I should maybe respond to what they've done in Europe, in response to the crisis between Ukraine and Russia, it was basically in a way to reduce their dependency on Russia's energy, and to be able to diversify that, so that so it is not necessarily or not entirely a climate change decision. It was a strategic decision that they needed to take into consideration in order to reduce their dependency on probably Russia and some other countries. So, but as you have rightly said, it is a balancing act, and I think the developed countries are making a lot of progress in terms of transitioning to green energy. And it is important also that in Africa, even as we want to leverage our fossil fuels, for instance, I think Uganda, now we've seen they've seen oil there, and they are willing to explore that and go into that. But in a way, you must do that in a way that you are not. So my argument is, when we talk about green transition, it is important that Africa also begin to take their place in these, in order not to be left behind. When you are left behind in a technology development, in technologies around greening, around green energies, it then becomes a lot of effort. You are just basically going to be playing catch up. And whether we like it or not, fossil fuel, they are going to be phased out. Eventually, it may take 50 years, it may take 100 years. So in order for you not to be left out in this transitioning, you need to begin now to then invest in green infrastructure and see, even while we are exploring in a way fossil fuel, because we need to grow our economy, as it were. For instance, Nigeria is an oil-dependent country, so you can't just say tomorrow, pack your bags and go. But even as we continue to explore and take opportunities around fossil fuel, and as even as the phasing out of it is going on, you need then to begin to think around investing in green infrastructure, in green energy, and also pursuing this just transition. Otherwise, you will be left behind. And the dangers of being left behind is also what we are seeing globally now, in that there is a lot of infrastructural deficit that we have in Africa now, and basically then that we are now playing catch up. If we also don't take care of this green transition, we are going to be playing catch up, which will not be good for us.
All right, thank you so much, Daniel Adele. Definitely lots of things that African governments can do while we are calling for an inclusive and equitable transition. African governments still have a role to play, especially on its dependency with our fossil fuels. Thank you so much for joining us on this conversation, Daniel Adele.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.